It was supposed to be just another quiet morning in a place where nothing ever changed, the kind of routine most people never question, the kind of life that moves so predictably you stop noticing the details. And for Daniel Carter, that routine was everything: the same hallway, the same mirror, the same reflection staring back at him every single day, until one morning something shifted in a way so small it could have been ignored, and for a moment he almost did. Because the first time Daniel Carter noticed it, he thought it was nothing, just a trick of the eye, a delay, something his mind would correct if he didn't think too much about it. But then it happened again, and this time he didn't move at all. He just stood there, staring at the mirror in his hallway, watching carefully, waiting, and that's when he saw it clearly: his reflection blinked. Before he did, not at the same time, not a fraction behind, but ahead, just enough to make his chest tight as his brain tried to make sense of something it had never been forced to understand before. Because reflections don't lead, they follow, they obey, they mirror. And yet in that moment the version of himself in the glass wasn't responding to him. It was acting on its own timing, like it already knew what was about to happen. And for a few seconds Daniel didn't move, he didn't breathe. He didn't even blink, because something deep inside him was telling him that if he did, he would confirm what he was already beginning to fear. And then slowly, almost unwillingly, he raised his hand, and what he saw next stayed with him long after that moment ended, because his reflection had already raised its hand 3 seconds earlier, not as a delay, but as a preview, a quiet, undeniable glimpse into something that shouldn't exist. Something that couldn't be explained away by faulty lighting or tired eyes. Something that made the room feel different even though nothing had physically changed. And as he stood there, heart beginning to race, one thought pushed through every logical explanation he had ever relied on. Because this wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't something he could simply ignore and move past. It was something else entirely, something that challenged the very idea of cause and effect. And in that moment, as the silence in the hallway stretched longer than it should have, Daniel Carter realized something that would follow him into every reflection he would ever see again. Because the mirrors in his house weren't broken, they weren't delayed, they weren't malfunctioning in any way he could understand. They were showing him something ahead of time, something precise, something consistent, and something that raised a question far more unsettling than the event itself. Because if a reflection could move before he did, then what else was it capable of showing? And more importantly, what would happen when the reflection showed something he couldn't take back? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, the kind of thing your mind plays on you when you're tired or distracted, something easy to dismiss if you don't give it attention. And for a brief moment, Daniel Carter tried to do exactly that, telling himself there had to be a reasonable explanation, that maybe the mirror was old, maybe the lighting in the hallway was uneven, maybe his eyes were simply adjusting too slowly. But what Daniel saw next couldn't be explained, because the delay didn't fade, it didn't correct itself. It didn't return to normal the way small visual errors usually do. Instead, it became clearer, sharper, more defined, like whatever was happening wasn't random at all. It was consistent, deliberate, and quietly repeating itself in a way that made ignoring it impossible. And that's when the questions began to settle in, not all at once, but slowly, one after another, each one heavier than the last. Because if this wasn't his imagination, if this wasn't stress or fatigue or some harmless glitch in perception, then what exactly was he looking at? Was Daniel Carter imagining it? Or was something real happening right in front of him? Something that didn't follow the normal rules he had trusted his entire life? And if it was real, then why were the mirrors showing moments before they happened? Why would something so ordinary suddenly behave in a way that suggested time itself was shifting, bending, moving ahead without him? And the question that stayed with him the longest wasn't just about what he was seeing. It was about what it meant. Because if a reflection could move before him once, then it could do it again. And if it could do it again, then what happens when the reflection shows something he can't escape? Something permanent, something final, something that doesn't give him time to react. And as those thoughts began to take shape, the quiet comfort of his routine started to feel different, heavier, uncertain, like every reflection now carried a possibility he wasn't prepared for. And the more he thought about it, the more one realization began to take hold, because what started as seconds, something small enough to question, something easy to doubt, quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Something that didn't just challenge what he was seeing, but everything he believed about time, control, and the simple assumption that the next moment always belongs to you. Daniel Carter was not the kind of man who invited uncertainty into his life. He built everything around consistency, structure, and quiet predictability. The kind of routine that gave him a sense of control over a world that rarely offers it. He woke up at the same time every morning, took the same route to work, sat at the same desk in an office where numbers behaved exactly as they should, where outcomes could be calculated and verified, where nothing moved unless there was a reason for it to move. And that was exactly why he had chosen that life. Because Daniel believed that if you followed the rules closely enough, if you avoided unnecessary risks, if you stayed within the boundaries of what made sense, then life would remain manageable, understandable, and most importantly, safe. He lived alone in a modest apartment that reflected that same mindset: simple, organized, nothing out of place, nothing that demanded attention, and certainly nothing that suggested anything unusual was happening within its walls. But that belief, that quiet confidence in routine and logic, was about to be tested in a way he had never prepared for because Daniel was the kind of man who trusted what he could see. He relied on it, grounded himself in it, measured his world through it. But what happens when what you see can't be trusted? What happens when the very thing you depend on to confirm reality begins to show you something else entirely? Something that doesn't follow the same rules, something that moves ahead of you instead of with you. And slowly, without warning, that question began to take shape inside his life. Not as a dramatic shift, not as something obvious, but as something subtle, something easy to overlook at first, something that blended into the background of his routine just enough to be dismissed. Until it couldn't be dismissed anymore because the apartment itself, the one place he believed would always remain constant, started to feel different in a way he couldn't explain. It was an older building, slightly worn, the kind of place that had seen years of quiet lives pass through it without leaving much behind. And when Daniel first moved in, the mirrors had already been there, mounted in the hallway, fixed in the bathroom, placed in positions that felt ordinary, practical. Nothing that stood out or raised questions, and yet, as the days passed and the small inconsistencies began to appear, those mirrors started to feel less like objects and more like something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to the same predictable world he had built around himself, because the mirrors had always been there. Long before Daniel arrived, and whatever was happening now didn't feel new, it felt like something that had been waiting, something that had gone unnoticed until the moment it chose to reveal itself. And at first, the signs were so minor they barely registered. A reflection that lagged for a second before correcting itself, a flicker of light in the mirror that didn't match the room, objects shifting slightly ahead in the reflection before settling into place in reality. Things that could easily be explained away if you weren't looking closely, if you weren't paying attention, and Daniel tried not to pay attention. He told himself it was nothing, that old buildings have quirks, that lighting can distort perception, that the mind fills in gaps when it's tired, and for a while that explanation was enough at first. It was easy to ignore, easy to move past, easy to convince himself that what he was seeing didn't matter. But the problem with ignoring something that keeps repeating is that eventually it stops being background noise and starts demanding your attention. And the more it happened, the harder it became to look away, because each time it occurred, it felt slightly more defined, slightly more intentional, like whatever was causing it wasn't random at all. It was consistent, measured, almost patient. And that quiet persistence is what began to unsettle him the most, not fear, not panic, but the growing awareness that this wasn't going away, that it wasn't correcting itself, that it was becoming part of his reality whether he accepted it or not. And that's when the shift happened, not in the mirrors but in him, because once you start noticing something like that, once it enters your awareness, you can't return to the comfort of not knowing. Every glance becomes deliberate. Every reflection becomes something you question, something you watch more closely than you ever have before. And Daniel Carter, the man who built his life around certainty, found himself standing in front of something that offered none at all. And the more he tried to hold on to his routine, the more it began to slip in ways he couldn't control, because what started as small inconsistencies was slowly building towards something else, something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Something that felt closer every time he looked into those mirrors, and by the time he realized that ignoring it was no longer an option, it had already gone too far, because one night, when the silence in his apartment felt heavier than usual, when the air seemed to hold still in a way that made every sound more noticeable, the reflection didn't just move first, it reacted. The moment everything changed didn't arrive with noise or warning, it came quietly, in a place Daniel Carter trusted more than any other, standing alone in his bathroom, the same place he had stood every morning without a second thought, the same mirror he had looked into hundreds of times without question. But that night something was different, not in the room, not in the lighting, not in anything he could point to directly, but in the way the reflection held itself. Because when Daniel stepped in and looked up, his reflection was already looking back at him, not in the passive, automatic way reflections usually do, but with a stillness that felt deliberate, aware, and for a brief second, neither of them moved, neither of them blinked, and then it happened, the reflection tilted its head slightly. Before Daniel did, and the moment he felt his own muscles respond, the realization hit him harder than anything before, because this wasn't a delay, it wasn't something catching up, it wasn't something correcting itself, it was happening first, consistently, undeniably first. And as he stood there trying to hold himself still, trying to break the pattern, the reflection raised its hand slowly, calmly, as if it had already decided what would happen next. And only after those few seconds passed did Daniel feel his own arm follow the exact same motion. And that was the moment the boundary broke completely, because it wasn't following him anymore. It was leading, and once that line had been crossed, everything that came after moved faster, more aggressively, like whatever force had been holding back was no longer interested in staying subtle, because the next signs didn't wait for him to question them, they forced themselves into his routine in ways he couldn't ignore, his phone lighting up on the table in the reflection before the real screen even flickered. Glass slipping from his hand in the mirror, and shattering silently while in reality it was still perfectly still for those few seconds before falling exactly the same way. the door to his apartment appearing open in the reflection while he stood there holding the handle untouched, unmoved, and each time it happened, the same pattern repeated. The reflection first, reality second, precise, controlled, unavoidable, and slowly, the explanation he had been trying to hold onto began to disappear. Because this wasn't random, this wasn't inconsistent, the mirror wasn't delayed. It was ahead, showing him something that had not yet happened but always would, and that certainty is what made it worse. Because if it was always right, then it wasn't showing possibilities, it was showing outcomes, and that realization settled in just as the situation escalated beyond anything he could dismiss. Because one night, as Daniel Carter stepped into his bedroom, exhausted, trying to distance himself from what he had been experiencing, his eyes lifted toward the mirror across the room. And what he saw this time didn't just unsettle him, it stopped him completely because, in the reflection, the apartment door behind him was wide open, and someone was standing inside, not moving, not speaking, just there, a figure outlined by the dim light beyond the doorway. Its features unclear but its presence unmistakable, and instinctively Daniel turned around, his breath tightening as he looked directly at the real door. Still closed, still locked, exactly as it should be, no movement, no sound, nothing out of place, and for a moment he held on to that, the reality he could confirm. The one that made sense, but when he turned back to the mirror, the figure had moved, closer now, standing just inside the room, its position no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and the gap between what was real and what was coming began to feel dangerously small because the door behind him was locked, but in the mirror. It wasn't, and as that thought settled in, something inside Daniel began to break, not all at once but gradually, piece by piece, as his sense of control started to slip away because this wasn't something he could predict or manage. This was something that was already moving ahead of him, unfolding without his input, and the more he tried to stay still to avoid triggering whatever came next, the more the reflection seemed to continue on its own path, as if it no longer needed him to begin. Only to follow, and that's when the fear truly set in, not fear of the unknown but fear of something already decided. Because when he looked back into the mirror again, the figure had moved even closer, now standing just a few steps behind where he would be if time caught up, its shape more defined, its presence heavier. And in that moment, Daniel understood something he hadn't wanted to accept: time inside the mirror wasn't waiting for him, it was moving forward without him, bringing something with it that he couldn't stop, couldn't delay, and couldn't escape by simply looking away. And as his breathing grew uneven and his thoughts struggled to keep pace with what he was seeing, one final image appeared that took everything he thought he understood and shattered it completely. Because when the reflection shifted again, when the moment advanced just a little further, what he saw wasn't the figure, wasn't the door, wasn't the room as it had been moments before, it was something else entirely, something that held him in place longer than anything else had so far, because the reflection showed something worse, something final, something that removed any illusion of control he had left. And as he stared at it, unable to look away, one realization settled in with a weight he couldn't ignore, because the person lying there, motionless on the floor, was him. After that moment, Daniel Carter didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, but because closing his eyes felt like giving up the only control he had left. And instead of trying to forget what he had seen, he did the opposite: he tried to understand it, to break it down the only way he knew how, with logic, observation, and repetition. Because if there was a pattern, then there had to be an explanation, and if there was an explanation, then maybe there was a way to stop it. So the first thing he did was remove the source, or at least what he believed was the source. He covered every mirror in his apartment, the hallway, the bathroom, the bedroom, anything that could reflect even the smallest image of himself. And for a brief moment, standing in that dim, covered space, he felt a sense of relief, like he had finally cut off whatever had been watching him, whatever had been moving ahead of him. But that relief didn't last, because when he reached for his phone, the dark screen reflected his face back at him, and in that reflection, it happened again, the same delay, the same movement ahead of time, and suddenly it didn't matter where he looked. The phenomenon wasn't tied to the mirrors anymore. It had spread beyond them, into glass, into screens, into anything capable of showing him himself, and that was the moment the situation shifted from something contained to something inescapable, because no matter where he looked, it followed. And once that realization settled in, Daniel stopped trying to avoid it and started trying to track it, documenting every instance, writing down the time, the delay, the outcome, comparing what he saw with what actually happened, treating it like a problem that could be solved if he just gathered enough information, enough data, enough proof that this was something grounded in reality, and not something happening inside his own mind. But even as he built that record, even as the pattern became clearer, another set of explanations began to push their way in, quieter, more unsettling, the kind that didn't rely on external causes but internal ones. Because what if this wasn't happening outside of him at all? What if it was something within him, something neurological, something psychological: sleep deprivation, stress, a mind pushed too far into routine suddenly breaking under pressure, hallucinations that felt real because they followed a consistent pattern. And for a while, Daniel considered it, not because he believed it fully, but because it was the only explanation that kept the world intact, the only one that didn't require him to accept that something impossible was unfolding around him. But that explanation began to fall apart the same way the others had, because hallucinations don't stay consistent, they don't predict outcomes with precision, They don't repeat themselves in a way that aligns perfectly with reality every single time. And what Daniel was experiencing wasn't random. It was structured, measurable, and increasingly precise. And that precision is what made the next phase even harder to ignore. Because the delay didn't stay at seconds, it began to stretch slowly at first, then more noticeably until the reflection wasn't just showing moments ahead. It was showing minutes, clear, undeniable glimpses of events before they happened. And the content of those reflections began to change as well, becoming more intense. More urgent, more difficult to dismiss. Because now he wasn't just seeing objects move or lights flicker, he was seeing himself fall, seeing himself lose balance and hit the ground, seeing blood where there hadn't been any moments before, seeing himself lying still in ways that forced him to confront something he hadn't wanted to accept since the first time it appeared. And each time he saw it, each time the reflection showed that same outcome, the same final image, he tried to prevent it. He moved differently. Reacted faster, adjusted his actions in ways he thought would interrupt the sequence, but no matter what he did, the result remained the same, just as precise, just as inevitable, and slowly that led him to a question he couldn't ignore, not about what was happening, but about his role in it, because if every outcome he saw ended the same way despite his attempts to change it, then what part of the process was actually fixed? Was it the future itself? Or was it something about the way he responded to it? And that question began to shape everything that followed, because once you start questioning your own reactions, your own patterns, your own habits, you begin to see them differently, not as choices, but as predictable sequences, things you do without thinking, things you repeat because they've always worked before. And that's when the internal conflict began to take hold in a way that felt heavier than anything external. Because Daniel Carter was no longer just dealing with something he couldn't explain, he was dealing with something he might not be able to control. And the options in front of him didn't offer clarity, they only deepened the uncertainty. Should he leave the apartment entirely, remove himself from the environment and hope it ended? Should he ignore it completely and trust that it would stop if he stopped acknowledging it? Or should he do the opposite and trust it, follow it? Use it as a guide to avoid whatever outcome it was showing him. And none of those choices felt safe. None of them felt certain because each one relied on an assumption he couldn't verify. And as he stood there, surrounded by covered mirrors and reflected images that no longer needed those mirrors to appear, one question settled in with a weight that refused to lift. Because what he was experiencing didn't feel like randomness anymore. It felt structured, intentional, moving towards something specific. And the more it progressed, the more it felt like time itself was narrowing into a single direction. And that's when the thought finally took shape in a way he couldn't ignore. Because if every outcome happened exactly as the reflection showed, if every attempt to change it only led back to the same result, then maybe the issue wasn't the future at all, maybe it wasn't fixed in the way he had been thinking. And that possibility changed everything, because it introduced a different kind of question. One that shifted the focus away from what was coming and toward what was causing it, because what if the future wasn't fixed, but triggered? By the time that thought fully settled in, Daniel Carter was no longer trying to escape what he was seeing. He was studying it, breaking it apart piece by piece, because if the future he kept witnessing wasn't fixed, if it was somehow tied to his own behavior, then the only way to prove it was to disrupt that behavior completely, to act in a way he normally wouldn't, something unpredictable even to himself, and that realization marked the first real shift in his approach, because until that moment, every action he had taken was still rooted in instinct, in habit, in the same patterns he had followed his entire life. Even his attempts to avoid what he saw were still reactions, still part of a system that could be anticipated, and if the reflections were truly ahead of him, then they weren't just seeing what would happen, they were calculating it based on what he always did. And that meant there was only one way to break it: he had to stop being predictable. So the next time the reflection showed something, he didn't respond the way he normally would. He didn't correct it, didn't try to stop it, didn't even prepare for it. He simply let it happen differently. And the first test came sooner than he expected. Because as he stood near the kitchen counter, he caught the familiar shift in the reflection of the darkened screen beside him. A glass slipping from his hand, falling in a clean, precise arc toward the floor, something he had seen before. Something he had always reacted to by catching it just in time. But this time he didn't move. He kept his hands exactly where they were, resisting the urge to follow the pattern he knew so well. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to hold still, the reflection continuing its motion, the glass falling in silence, and then reality caught up. But not in the way he expected, because instead of matching what he had seen, the sequence broke, the timing shifted. The glass hit the edge of the counter instead of the floor, bounced once and rolled to a stop without shattering. And for the first time since this began, the outcome didn't align. The reflection had shown one result, but reality delivered another. And that single moment carried more weight than everything that had come before it, because it proved something he hadn't been certain was even possible. And as he stood there, staring at the glass unmoving, his mind caught up with what had just happened. Because for the first time, the mirror was wrong, and that realization changed everything, not just in what he was seeing, but in how he understood it, because if the reflection could be wrong, then it wasn't showing something fixed, it wasn't revealing an unchangeable future. It was doing something else entirely, something far more complex and far more unsettling. It was predicting, calculating, projecting outcomes based on patterns it expected him to follow, and once that became clear, the rest of the pieces began to fall into place. Every moment he had seen before, every outcome that had played out exactly as shown, they hadn't been forced, they had been followed, triggered by his own predictable reactions. his own habits guiding him into the exact future the reflection had already mapped out. And that meant the real problem wasn't the mirror, it wasn't time, it was him, or more specifically, the version of him that never changed, never deviated, never broke away from the path he had always taken. And that realization settled in with a clarity that cut through the confusion he had been dealing with since the beginning. Because the mirror wasn't showing destiny, it was showing probability, a projection of what would happen if nothing changed, if he remained the same, if he continued to respond the way he always had. And that understanding brought with it a new kind of tension, not fear of what he couldn't control, but awareness of what he could, because now the responsibility shifted entirely onto him. And with that shift came the final challenge, the one outcome he had seen more clearly than any other, the one that had remained consistent no matter what he tried before. Because as he turned back toward the mirror, uncovering it slowly, deliberately, he was met with the same image that had been waiting for him from the beginning, himself lying on the floor motionless, the room around him still unchanged, a moment that felt final in a way nothing else had. And for a second the weight of that image returned, the same pressure, the same sense of inevitability, but this time it carried something different with it, not certainty but possibility, because now he understood what it represented, not an ending he couldn't escape, but a path he had always been following without realizing it. And as he stood there, facing it directly, one thought settled in with absolute clarity, because this time he had one chance to change it. Daniel Carter stood there longer than he ever had before, not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because for the first time he did. The reflection in front of him no longer felt like a warning he couldn't avoid. It felt like a pattern waiting to be broken. And as he looked into the mirror, the same final image appeared once again, clear and unchanged, his body lying on the floor still silent, the outcome that had repeated itself every time he tried to interfere before. But this time something was different, not in the reflection, but in him, because instead of reacting to it, instead of preparing to stop it or move away from it, Daniel made a decision that went against everything he had done up until that point. He chose not to act at all, not out of fear, but with intention, because if every outcome had been driven by his responses, then the only way to truly break the sequence was to remove the response entirely. And so he stood there, completely still, his eyes fixed on the reflection, his breathing controlled, his body resisting every instinct that told him to move, to adjust, to prepare for what was coming. Because for once he wasn't trying to outrun the future he had seen, he was refusing to participate in it. And at first nothing changed, the reflection remained exactly as it had been, the same image, the same outcome, the same stillness on the floor. But as the seconds passed, something subtle began to shift, not in the room around him, but within the reflection itself, a slight distortion, a flicker so small it would have gone unnoticed before. And then it happened again, stronger this time, as if the sequence it had been following was beginning to lose its structure. And Daniel didn't move, he held his position, forcing himself to remain outside the pattern, and slowly the image in the mirror began to break. The version of himself on the floor fatting, distorting, no longer holding its shape with the same certainty it once had. Until finally, it disappeared completely, replaced by his actual reflection, standing exactly where he was, moving only when he moved, matching him perfectly. And in that moment, the tension that had been building since the beginning lifted in a way that felt almost unreal. Because for the first time there was no delay, no projection, no glimpse into something ahead of him, just a reflection behaving exactly as it should. And as Daniel watched it, testing it with small movements, confirming what he was seeing, one realization settled in with quiet clarity. Because the future hadn't been something imposed on him, it hadn't been something fixed or unavoidable, the future didn't trap him. His habits did, the patterns he followed without thinking, the predictable ways he responded to every situation, those were the things that had shaped what he kept seeing. And once those patterns were broken, the outcome lost its certainty, and the mirror lost its hold over him. And as the silence returned to his apartment, no longer heavy, no longer filled with the tension of something waiting ahead, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because his understanding of it had. And slowly, as the moments passed without interruption, without distortion, the mirrors around him returned to what they had always been, ordinary still, nothing more than reflections of the present. And yet, even as that normalcy settled back into place, one thought remained, quiet but impossible to ignore, because what Daniel Carter had experienced wasn't just about mirrors or reflections or something unexplainable, it was about something much closer, something far more common than he had ever considered. And as he stood there looking at his reflection one last time, perfectly aligned, perfectly ordinary, a single question lingered, one that extended far beyond that room, far beyond that moment. Because if the future can follow the patterns we never question, if it can shape itself around the choices we make without even realizing it, then how many of us are already living a future we never chose? And as the silence settled and Daniel Carter finally stepped away from the mirror, no longer questioning what it might show him next, the weight of what he had experienced didn't disappear. It shifted, turning into something far more personal, something that reaches beyond his story and into something we all quietly live with every day. Because if you saw your future, would you try to change it? Would you have the discipline to step outside the patterns you've followed your entire life? Or would you follow it without even realizing, repeating the same reactions, the same habits, the same choices that slowly shape where you end up? And that's the question this story leaves behind, not just about Daniel Carter, but about all of us, because sometimes the future isn't something waiting ahead, Sometimes it's something we're already creating without thinking, so let me know what you would do. Would you break the pattern or stay within it? And if this made you think differently, if it stayed with you even for a moment. Then subscribe for more stories that stay with you.